Hi everyone, welcome back to MUS119. Today we're going to look at Module 6C, and the topic for today is farewell pancakes. So we're going to learn something new, which is called inversions, and that is basically the opposite of pancakes. So remember when we talked about pancakes, that was to make sure that all of the notes that you write in that chord are, either line, 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 or space, space, space. So we don't want any floating pancakes. We don't want any squished pancakes, things like this. We didn't want those things back then. But today, we're actually going to start learning something called inversions, where you are no longer going to be restricted to writing chords in the pancake style. So let's just do a quick review. When you have a chord, when you have a triad, the bottom note is called the root. And then we have the third, and then we have the fifth. And in the case of a seventh chord, you would have the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. And this has been true for root position chords. But from today, we're going to learn something called inversions. And inversions are when we sort of reshuffle the notes so that it's no longer the root at the bottom of the chord. So for example, let's just take a C major chord. C, E, and G, which would sound like. And this chord, we have the C at the bottom. That's the root position, that's the pancake position. But we can also rewrite this chord as E, C, and G, which would look like this. And together, this we actually call it a first inversion chord. And likewise, we could also have the G as the note at the bottom. So we can have G first, and then C and E. And together, this we will call a second inversion chord. And of course, the pancake one is going to be called a root position chord. Inversions are actually really, really useful because of the following two reasons. It gives you a smoother bass line, and then it also creates harmonic variety. So the first aspect is smoother bass line. So bass line means in any music, especially in this kind of four-part writing, which means each line or each note among these four notes is going to be sung by this one voice part. Remember SATB that we talked about? Like in a choir, we have soprano, alto, tenor, bass, right? And when you have this type of four-part writing, sometimes if the composer or the arranger is not very good at what they do, it can actually make it pretty hard to sing. So let's take a look at this first example. This first one is going to sound like this. Well, of course, the most obvious part is the melody. That's the top line. So that sounds like da, 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 da. It's pretty easy to sing actually. But what about the other parts? And I want you to actually pay attention to the bottom voice, the bass voice. So let me try to play it again while singing. That's the bass. Da, 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 da. Okay, I can sing it. I think if I actually practice it, I think I can sound pretty good. But I don't know if you notice, if you try to sing this along with me, it's da 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 of gaps moving up and down. So instead of writing something like this, if we use inversion, we can have something that sounds like this. Okay, now let me try to sing the bass line. So this one is a lot easier to sing actually, and that's what I meant by a smoother bass line. So in this case, you will see that we have something called inverted chords, inversions, but in order to actually see that, we need to first, reduce these chords into close position chords, and then from there, you would find out the root position chords. So we're going to skip that part for now because we have something similar later, but I just want you to know that if we use inversions, because you can move the notes in the chord around, you can kind of try to get a smoother bass line, and that really helps in practical situations. Okay, so now let's take a look at how these chords look in the root position and also in the inverted positions. So the first one is, of course, the pancakes. So this one, that's pancake, triad. This one is also pancakes, but this is a seventh chord, right? Because it has 4 notes. So this first one, this is actually F, A, and C. And then the second chord here is A, C, and F. The third chord here is C, F, and A. So make sure that you're aware that all of these chords have the same notes. It's just which note gets to be at the bottom, which note gets to be the lowest note, because that provides you, the context and which position it is in. So this one, this other one here is C, E, G, and B flat. And same thing, this first inversion chord right here is E, G, B flat, and then C. And then here is G, B flat, C, and E. And then we have B flat, C, E, and G. So we have root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. Now let's learn how to write these different chords in Roman numerals. So as we all know by now, that root position chord means the root of the chord is in the bass. That's the lowest note. First inversion means that the third of the chord is in the bass. Second inversion, the fifth of the chord, right? And in seventh chords means that the chord has 4 notes instead of 3. In seventh chords, if the root is actually in the lowest position, then that's called a root position, if it looks like pancakes, right? And for first inversion chords, that's when you have the third as the lowest note. If you have the fifth as the lowest note, it's going to be called a second inversion. And then if you have the seventh as the lowest note, that will be a third inversion. Okay, so root, third, fifth, and seventh. If you have the pancake form, this is the root, this is the third, fifth, and seventh. And in this case, what we have is C, E, G, and B flat. So here, that's C in the lowest position, and here we have an E. So the C has been moved up. It doesn't matter where C is, as long as the lowest note is an E, we can call it first inversion. So all that matters is really just the lowest note. That's what we use to determine the position of the chord, whether it's a root position or inversions. Okay, so this next one has a G at the bottom. That's why it's called second inversion, because it's the fifth, right? And then we have a B flat as the lowest note in this chord, and that's called the third inversion. So now let's actually learn how to write Roman numerals that would include, inversions. So normally for Roman numerals, I think so far what you've seen is things like 1 or 5, or if it's a seventh chord, it has a 5/7. And you also have 2/7 or 7 half diminished 7, right? You've seen these, but what if we want to also include the inverted chords? So that's when these numbers here come in. So the numbers here are basically intervals between the lowest note and the upper two notes. Okay, so this number 3 means that, hey, the interval between the F and the A, that's a third. And then between the F and the C, that's a fifth. Okay, so 5 and 3. And the next chord, this is a third, and this is a sixth. And here, that's a fourth, and that's a sixth. So I think you can kind of understand by now why we have these numbers here. So technically, this is in F major, and this is F A C. So that means, hey, this is an F major chord in F major key, which means that this is going to be a major 1 chord, right? Major 1. This is root position. So again, technically, we should have 1 and then 5/3, because these numbers tell you the interval. The next one should be 1/6/3, 1/6/4. But over the years, what people did was to ignore some of those numbers that, even though theoretically this makes perfect sense, I think people just got fed up with having to write these numbers again and again when they are, writing the inverted chords. So they keep these numbers at a minimum, just enough to tell you that, hey, this is first inversion, this is second inversion. So what they did was to eliminate 3s and 5s and just keep the other ones so that it's really easy to tell. So if you see a 1 chord, let me just rewrite it so that it's not confusing for you. If you see just Roman numeral 1, that means, hey, this is the major 1 chord in this key, and it's in root position. If it's in first inversion, which means the third of the chord is now the lowest note, this is going to be 1/6. And the second inversion is 1/6/4. And for the seventh chords here, if it's a root position chord, in this case, in F major key, we're dealing with a C 7 chord. C7, that's in C major minor 7. In this case, F, G, A, B flat, C, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're actually writing the 5 chord here. So this is the 5 chord. And if it's a root position 7th chord, we would write 5/7, which is what you already know at this point. But what about inversions? Well, if the third of the chord is at the bottom, then that's first inversion. In that case, we would actually write 5/6/5. We're taking this part and ignoring the 3. If it's second inversion, we will write 5/4/3. If it's third inversion, we write 5/4/2. So what I usually like to tell my students is to just memorize it. It's good to understand, but it's a lot faster to just memorize these numbers. So if it's a triad and you're dealing with these different positions, what you have to remember is if it's root position, then it has nothing, right? No number, nothing. And first inversion, that's a 6. Second inversion, 6/4. So nothing, 6, 6/4. For seventh chords, it's 7, 6/5, 4/3, 4/2. 7, 6/5, 4/3, 4/2. I remember back in the college days, I would actually write this all over my book just so that I remember the numbers. So just remember, if it's a 7, then that means this is the root position 7th chord. 6-5 first inversion, 4-3 second inversion, 4-2 third inversion. Okay, moving on. Now let's take a look at this example. The very first thing I would like to recommend everyone to do is to first write out all of the chords in this key. So in this case, we have a C major key. And a C major, that would be the one with no flat, no sharp. And I would first write out all of the chords, including 2, 5, and 7. Those are the ones that have 7th chords. Okay, so let's get started. All right, now we have the chords. Of course, it's helpful to also just write the root of each chord: C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. So the next thing we can do is to reduce these chords into what's called close positions, right? So why don't I just play this one time just so that you have an idea of how it sounds. All right, so we have this 4-part chorale, which means each part is sung by one voice part. So we have soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and that's usually the setting for a standard choir. So in this case, we're going to first reduce them. So I would always recommend you to write the letter names out if music is still pretty new to you, because I think that will make it a lot easier. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and write out all of the chords, all of the notes in letter names. All right, now as a side note, here we have a little star that says this is a non-chord tone and should be ignored in your harmonic analysis. Non-chord tone just means that it's not a note that's included in the chord. So if you look at the chord before, we have C, we have A, E, and C, and then the chord that comes after is F and A, and this B is actually not really relevant, or it's not within those chords. What it is here is actually what's called a passing tone. So a passing tone is when you have, this melody where you have C right here, C, and then the next one is A, and you can still play what's written. We have da, da, but if you add that note in the middle and act, which can act as a passing tone, it sounds a lot smoother. All right, so that's what it is, so we can just ignore that note in our analysis. Once we have the letter names, the next thing you can do is to first write these notes out in what's called close position. So please remember that in close position, because now we're dealing with inversions, the lowest note is going to be exactly the note that you start with. Okay, so this first one right here is the lowest note, C. We start from here, and what's the next higher note that follows C? So we have C, E, and G. The next note is definitely going to be E, and then G. Well, this one is a root position chord because it's the perfectly stacked pancakes, right? So in this case, the answer has already been given. So that's the one chord, major one chord, and C major. Now the next one is going to be B, and then we have D and G. So D is going to be here, G is going to be here. Well, this one is an inverted chord. If you have an inverted chord, you have to also find out the root position chord at the same time. So B, D, G is inverted. And if you reshuffle the notes, you will find out that if we start from G, and then B, and then D, you're going to get the root position chord. So the bottom note here is G. G in C major, G, B, D. This chord is going to be the 5 chord, right? In this case, we have only a triad and not a 7th chord. We only have 3 notes, 3 different notes. So this is just going to be a 5 chord. But it's not just a 5 chord, it is a 5 chord with an inversion. And in this case, this is a first inversion, which means we're going to use 5, 6. All right, moving on. The next one, we have A, C, and E, right? So this one is also pancakes. So this bottom note, which is an A, is going to tell us what chord this is. In C major key, the one that starts with A is this one, right? A, C, E. That's a minor 6 chord. So there you have it. And this one is pretty interesting because if you look at the notes, the individual notes here, we have F, 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 and A. Well, a triad needs 3 notes. And if you have just 2 notes, that's not a triad. That's just an interval. But remember in the previous lecture, we talked about how in a chord, in a triad, we have the root, the third, the fifth. The root and third, these ones are important because the root is a root, so it's important. The third is important because it tells you whether it's major or minor, right? It tells you the quality. But the fifth is optional. All right, of course, having C, E, G sounds like, a proper triad. But if we only have C and E, we can actually kind of be fooled into thinking this is actually a full chord. Okay, so in this case, that's the same thing. F, we have A, but the C is missing. Even then, we can still call it an F major chord. Okay, so in this case, I'm just going to write F, A, and C, even though the C doesn't really exist in this chord. So FAC in C major is going to be a major 4 chord. All right, next one, we have G, we have C, we have E, and then G. So in this case, we are going to first just write the G, and the next closest note is going to be C, and the next closest note, E. Well, this one is definitely an inverted chord. So first we have to change it back into root position. G, C, E is inverted. If we move the G up, C, E, G. Well, that's what we are familiar with, right? We have C, E, G. So C, E, G, the C major chord, in a C major key, that's definitely going to be a 1. But don't forget, we are dealing with an inverted chord here, right? Whatever we write on this side, that's just so that we can find out what Roman numeral it actually is. So the Roman numeral will come from the root position chord, and then the inversion, the numbers that we write next to the Roman numeral, comes from the actual chord. So in this case, G, C, and E, that's a second inversion, right? Because the G is the 5th of the chord. So second inversion is going to be 6/4. All right, so this is the method that we're going to use. This is the most foolproof method. And as you do more and more exercises in terms of harmonic analysis, you're going to get pretty good and you won't need to follow every single step. But for now, please try to write down all the chords that are in this major key first, and then also write down all of the letter names and reduce them into close position chords, and just follow every step because that's going to be really critical at this stage of learning. So what I'm going to do is to complete this exercise for you. You can now just pause the video and try to complete it on your own, and then you can come back and check the answers with me. All right, so the final answers are going to be 1, 5, 6, 6, 4, 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 6, 6, 2, 6, 5, 7, and 1. Okay, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or set up a time with me to meet in office hour. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next lecture.